Have you heard of the legend of the Minecraft camel? It's a tale of survival and unexpected betrayal. And so without any further ado, let's dive right into this lost legend. The start of the camel story begins millions of years ago in the harsh and unforgiving land known as the snowy tundra. You see, millions of years ago, the overworld was in the grip of an ice age, with the only biomes existing in the overworld being the frozen forests, the snowy tundras, and the frozen oceans. Life was hard for all of the animals that lived there, as food was rare, shelter was low, and safety was a luxury. But the ancient world wasn't always like this, as back in those ancient times, only a few decades before this ice age, the overworld was once a warm and abundant place, home to a diverse range of animals and civilizations. But for some unknown reason, the world began to cool, and eventually it became entirely frozen, which caused the death of billions of plants and animals, many of whom would be lost forever, with no surviving descendants. And so because of that, there were only a few very lucky species that were able to adapt to the harsh conditions and survive. But even then, life was hard, and so because of that, many of the survivors who were still able to adapt would also die. And so that brings us on to the camels. Now, the camels were able to survive due to their thick fur, which kept the cold out, and their large humps, which stored large amounts of food as energy that they could use at a later date. Also, unlike many other animals, the camels formed large herds, which provided safety in numbers. However, life was still difficult, even for the camels, as still many of them just didn't have enough food, and so because of that, many more camels would die of starvation. And so it was over just a very short 100-year time span that the camels were reduced from a plentiful species to one that was critically endangered, and that was only being sustained by one remaining herd. And so it looked as if they too, just like the billions of other species, would also die out, and they too would be forgotten forever. But then, one day, everything changed. As while still in their herd formation, they stumbled across an oasis. It was filled with water and food, and it was unlike anything that they had ever seen before, and there was no other animal within it. They were the first to find it. And so the camels decided to stay there, and to make this oasis their permanent new home. And so it was over the next few weeks that they began to take control of this land and its resources. And so it was over the next 1,000 years that the camels dominated over the oasis, ruling over its resources and growing in population to the point where there were now over 1 billion camels. And so it would be fair to say that life was pretty good for the camels, as they ruled over this wild land without any opposition. However, things were about to change once again, as that ice age eventually ended and the world began to warm up once again, which slowly melted the ice within the world, which unexpectedly freed the cavemen who had taken refuge in caves during that ice age all those thousands of years ago. And so, with the cave entrances being exposed to natural sunlight for the first time in a very long time, the cavemen began to rise to the surface, coming out of their dark, deep caves. However, when many of them came out, it was still very cold, so much so that many of them decided to just return to the safety within their caves. But do you know where it wasn't cold? Well, the caves that were near to that oasis. And so it was in those caves that the cavemen began to leave the caves and would start to explore the oasis. Now, these cavemen were amazed with what they saw, as, keep in mind, they'd been shut away in the dark for thousands of years, and this oasis was just magical to them. And it took a few days of the cavemen exploring this oasis when they came across the camels. Now, they were very unfamiliar with these strange creatures, and so they began to arm themselves with cacti that they had pulled out of the ground just a few hours earlier, ready to attack. However, to the surprise of the cavemen, this only drew the camels closer towards them, as the camels loved cacti. And so they began to eat the cacti right out of the hands of the cavemen. They were shocked to see this, as this mammoth of a beast was just being so gentle and calm, eating a cactus from their hand. And so it was then that the cavemen were given an idea that would change the course of history, not only for the camels, but for the entire overworld. As the cavemen thought that they may be able to domesticate these camels using the cacti that they clearly loved, just as they had been able to do with Bones and the wolves. Except the camels will be much more useful, as they look to be much stronger, and so the cavemen thought they could use them for something much more than just a fence. Perhaps they could use them to build an empire. And so it was then that the process of the cavemen gathering up as much cactus as they could and transforming the camels from wild animals to tamed helpers began. And all the camels were loving it. They wanted more and more cactus, and so they began to be at the service of the cavemen, as they would just hope that the cavemen would give them more of that delicious cactus that they just couldn't gather for themselves. Now, let's fast forward another few hundred years to see what life was like for the camels. And well, it was quite different, as the domestication of the camels had marked a turning point in the history of the desert society. As with the camel's strength, the once primitive cavemen quickly transformed into a sophisticated and advanced civilization that was able to sprawl across the entire oasis. As over time, with more and more camels becoming domesticated, the camel species grew its importance within the desert society, as they began to become a crucial tool in the construction of the grand temples and desert cities that were made by that desert civilization. As the high levels of strength that the camels had allowed that society to move massive stones and construct those intricate structures, which became a symbol of progress and growth within this society, as they hoped that these grand buildings that used these extremely heavy stones would stand for millions of years. However, as that civilization continued to thrive, the treatment of the camels became increasingly harsh, as that civilization grew greedy for more growth and power, which meant exploitation of the camels only increased, which soon led to the camel population beginning to decline. Now, at first, no one noticed this, as their plan was working. They were growing more than ever before, and it was all thanks to the camels, as the camels of the desert were now the lifeblood of that society that lived there, and they were integral for their continued growth and survival, as the camels provided food and clothing. But despite their importance, the camels were still being treated very poorly, as they were forced to carry heavy loads of stone all across the scorching hot desert, and were given just enough food and water to survive these harsh quests. And so, as the years went by, the constant overworking of the camels took its toll, as their population began to dwindle. And before the desert society could realize the harm that they were doing to the camels, and really to themselves, it was too late, as all the domesticated camels had been killed, as the overworking had just run them out, which meant that in the world only wild camels remained. This was bad. Very bad for the desert civilization, as they relied on those domesticated camels to function and grow, and without them, they were doomed. And so the desert civilization tried to lure those wild camels into their civilization, as maybe they could domesticate them and they could use them, but this time they could treat them better. And so because of that, they began to build wells in the middle of the desert with the hope that those camels will come for the clean water within those wells. But the wild camels never came, as they had learnt from their past and had no trust for man-made structures. Also, they didn't need to get water from that civilization. There was plenty of water in the lakes, as for the last 100 years, those domesticated camels had never drunk from them. And so, back to that civilization, the loss of the camels was a turning point for them, as without their source of food and strength and clothing, they were forced to leave their home and to go and find a new source of strength and food. But at the same time, with the changing climate after the end of the Ice Age, there was now great potential to find new resources outside of the oasis. And so that's why the citizens of that desert civilization weren't too reluctant to leave behind their old ways and embark on a new journey, as they saw an opportunity to build something even greater in the future, even without the use of the camels, as there must be some sort of greater creature out there in the wild. And so as the years passed, with all the citizens gradually leaving the desert, they left behind their grand buildings and structures. And well, unfortunately, without the proper maintenance and care, those desert structures began to crumble. And eventually, most of them were completely destroyed, as they became engulfed by the desert below them, with only the grandest temples, which have been built with the most exploitation of the camels, remaining as a testament to the once great desert civilization. But still, over time, even the memory of the civilization would fade into obscurity, leaving only these strange giant temples as a distant reminder of the consequence of abusing your power, and the reminder of the importance of treating those you rely on with respect and care. And so, with all of the desert civilization finally gone, those wild camels were finally free from hunting, which meant they could begin to reclaim the desert, where they thrived for millions of years to come, finally being able to grow in population. And so that was one of the most prosperous times ever for the camels, and nothing was going to stop their rule this time, as they were now aware of the sneaky tricks of that desert civilization. But then one day, millions of years later, came the arrival of the villagers. But these villagers, unlike that evil old desert civilization, actually had a positive effect on the camels, as they took great care of them and tried to form a bond with them, attempting to become caretakers of them, as they tried to feed them, water them and groom them, all without expecting anything in return, as the villagers really just wanted to help. Now, the wild camels that were experiencing all of this were wary, as even though they, millions of years later, had no first-hand experience of the brutality of any civilization, they just had a natural fear of any intelligent life, as that fear had been passed down the generations from their ancestors, who sadly had. However, soon this fear would wear away, as the villagers just continued to treat the camels with respect and love, even when the camels didn't show that to the villagers at first. And so, eventually, the camels would soon open up to the villagers, and even allow themselves to work for the benefit of the villagers, as thanks for all the help that they were given for free. And so the villagers would soon develop an advanced saddle that would accompany 2 riders per camel, whilst still keeping the camel's comfort as a priority, so that way the villagers could ride the camel. And so it was because of this close bond that the camels had developed with the villagers that they would eventually start living in the villages, as the villagers were just so amazing to them that there was no longer a reason to live out in the wild anymore. Why not just stay with those amazing villagers? And they would stay in those villages for thousands of years. In fact, they're still there today. But now, what if I told you that those same villagers helping the camels right now were actually the descendants of that same society that had once oppressed the camels millions of years prior, that forced the domesticated ones into extinction? Now, the story of how this came to be and the change of nature for that civilization is long and complex. And for one to understand it, you would first need to know about the downfall of the new civilization that was built after they left the desert. However, to learn about that, well, you'll need to watch this video.